Okay, so I should probably just talk a little bit about why we put this up as a session idea. It kind of came from a confluence of events that would probably sound more dramatic if I said they all occurred in the space of a day, but that they occurred over a kind of period of time, and that's kind of what led to this. I'm from NetSafe. We offer a call centre service for all sorts of kind of generally cyber-related issues, and in fact, people ring us with all sorts of things that make your hair curl, and half of them are not related to cyber events. But on this one particular day, we got a call from a web design company in an area of the country I won't talk about because it will give away the next part of the story. But a web designer, a man who'd used to work for a large organisation who'd gone out on his own and managed to land himself a fairly significant customer. And there had been an issue with data disappearing from the website that he'd set up. So personal information had been leaked, and he rang us to find out what his position was. And it was a very general term, what is my position? I think he was talking about his own personal liability, and that was a conversation that we had with him in terms of how he had set up his relationship and what his obligations were to that client. We got a call on that same day from the client, who was a fairly large tertiary institution. Now, it wasn't the entire corporate website for this university, but it was a fairly important kind of registration website for students for a part of the university. And what had happened was that the information had quite openly been hacked and released and was available to other students, or other students within that university had found it and were using it, banding it around, throwing it about places. And obviously that was a pretty bad position for them. So we found ourselves in the middle of this situation. And we started to talk to both parties about what it was that they contractually agreed in the beginning. And what it turns out was that even though this was a fairly large university, there had been almost no contractual anything at all. In fact, all that had happened was somebody had issued a quote, somebody else had signed it, and that was the end of the paper trail between this large university and this kind of one-man band web design studio. So that started to kind of ring a few worrying bells. At the same time, over the beginning of this year, we watched a lot of, we do watch a lot of daily group buying websites just out of personal interest, because I was interested in how cheap you can get your teeth whitened for. But what we did start to notice was that there were quite a few website adverts appearing. So we saw one at $399 for a website, and then we saw one at $199, and then my personal favourite was the $99 website. Now, there's not a lot you can get for $99 in professional services. I've just had my car shampooed, both carpets and seats, and that cost more than $99. So the idea that you could produce a corporate website for $99 started to get, again, a little bit worrying. The third part of this kind of confluence of ideas for me was at the Commerce Commission's UFBIS, Ultra-Fast Broadband Conference. There was a panel of small businesses, and lots of things were said about what it was that small businesses needed, but there was one, I remember, that stuck with me, one very impassioned statement from the owner of a small business that said, when it comes to all this stuff, and he was quite broad about what he was talking about, we just want something that works. We just want someone to do something for us that just works. And you start to see, well, for me, that's where the troubling thing comes. You come between a business that says, I just want it to work, and then you see someone that says, $99 and I'll give you a website, and you see web design companies that don't really feel like they have any obligation to talk about what it is that they should do or can deliver, and you start to see there's a little bit of a hole out there for an awful lot of small businesses. And as we know, we're a country of small businesses. Huge number of our businesses have no employees, and these are the people, I think, that are out there looking for those $99 websites and a quick and easy, it just works for me solution. Now, you do a Google search on what I should expect from a web design company, and what you get is quite a lot of marketing material from web design companies about how great they are, about all the things that you should expect from a good design company. It generally fits with exactly what it is that they do. So you get a kind of broad range across a search like that about what it is you should expect. So again, there's a level of complication for anybody who's out there searching for what it is that a website should look like and what it is you should expect from someone that's producing a website. Now, Lance Wiggs wrote a great blog a few months ago about what it is you should expect, a buyer's and seller's guide, he called it, for websites. And there's a lot of great information in there. And he talks about price expectations and the kind of things that make a good and bad customer. And it kind of starts at a low ceiling of $5,000 and stretches all the way up to when you're doing development that costs $200,000 plus. And that's great as a guide for people who are in that space and in that market. But if you're actually in the $99, please give me a 4-page website because all I want to do is make it work for me market, then a lot of that information doesn't really apply. So it occurred to me that maybe there's a room out there for some kind of information for all those businesses. Let's face it, there's nothing wrong with wanting to pay $99 for a website. If I could get a really good website for $99, I'd like to do that. I don't want to spend $5,000 if I don't have to. But why is it that I should have to sacrifice what I get just because I don't want to pay very much money? It shouldn't necessarily have to be a case of I'm paying not very much, therefore I'm getting a whole lot of rubbish. Or it should be a case of my informed choice that if I want to pay $99, I should at least know up front that I'm going to get a whole lot of rubbish and all of my customer sensitive information is going to end up on a torrent site next week. So that's really kind of the idea behind why I proposed this session in the first place. And I don't know, I'm not entirely convinced, to be honest, that a consumer standard is what's needed. It was an idea that popped into my head that kind of was synthesized out of all of those situations. So that's what I want to talk about. Is the consumer standard something that's needed? Is it something else? Is it an industry body? I mean, I don't know, but I just think there needs to be a level of protection for an awful lot of small businesses who are trying to get themselves on the web, are already on the web, and want to make some changes to what it is they're doing, but are trying to be innovative in their business, are trying to exploit some of the opportunities that the internet gives them, and are, in some cases, getting right royally buggered in the process currently. So that's what I want to talk about. I started with a war story, a horror story. It's probably a good place to start if anybody's got any good or bad stories about the process, or just generally open it up to you guys to let me know what you think about the idea of a standard in general.
Or, if you prefer, how you feel about it as an individual citizen.
Hold on for the microphone.
So remember, we're really interested in your views on this one because we will feed them back. This gentleman here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential because
Gentleman there.
I don't think there's anything to.
Hello. Yeah. So just as a sort of a point of data, I guess I'm probably one of the offending folk in this. So I have an open source project, but also a company that operates on the sort of 6-figure or 5-figure at least website budget. But I guess the reason I speak up is that we definitely see a huge amount of demand for that $99 thing, and so the strategy that we have had is basically just to make some of the resources and the software freely available, but we just don't have time, energy, thought, mental energy, or anything like that to really do anything more than just basically put stuff out there. And so, from time to time, I'll agree to someone catching up from, with a cup of coffee or something like that, and then give them a few pointers. But again, that's about the maximum that we can do there. So I think there definitely is a demand, and I think technically it's quite possible to provide something around that area. But someone needs to I guess just come up with a best practice and say, look, this is like a cookie cutter thing that you can do, and then there needs to be some sort of technology piece around it. But from where I sit, we definitely see a lot of demand around that kind of thing.
Thank you.
So it's quite a refined mechanism. Got someone over here? Oh, we've got lots of people. I'll jump in first. Oh, he's got a mic. 100% agree.
Strictly necessary. There's not many people. So the first thing is, as a standard of service, I really like the idea, right? Because as you say, I pay $99, and I know, there's this sort of contract that if it's broken in some way, then I've got something to fall back on, and that's cool. But at the same time, I mean, this is a standard. This is just a standard trade-off, right? I mean, if you say that this is the minimum level of things, then those who are malicious and, as you say, want to get your personal details and stick them up on a torrent site, then they have a standard point of reference to start their attacks from. You see? So I'm just a little bit worried about that as an idea. I mean, on the other hand, sure, obfuscating standards is not something that I'm advocating. I'm just saying it's got to be a design concern that, by saying you've got this privacy standard, because, we are in the era where you and me can be commodities to certain dodgy people. We have to admit this if we design this kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's no way you could do and say, I guarantee that this is, this will never happen. We know with the best intentions of the world, there might be privacy and security issues. But I think what I think at the back of my mind is more, it's driving consumers to at least ask the questions up front. So before that university engaged that company, they could have said, have you even thought about this? Is there, how do you protect data? And if the answer of that agency had been, we don't, or we take no liability for that, then you can then, as a consumer, you can take that on, or you can say, actually, I'm moving on to somebody else. I want to ask the same question and get a better answer out of somebody else. And that's really what I hope a standard
Okay,
might
yeah.
be able to do.
Yeah, well, I was, just, as I say, the first concern is a sort of technical one. But so at the same time as this idea of a sort of standard, then as well as this, there's got to be a level of consumer education around this as well. I mean,
Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts around that, or just an admission that it's necessary?
Well, no, I think that has to be part of it. This is not just a tool for consumers in my mind. What's going on in my mind at the moment is it's also a tool for industry to be able to say back, and we being part of industry, NGOs and those other organisations, to be able to say to consumers, this is what the issues could be, and these are the things that you should think about as a consumer, not just labelling it all on the providers, but making sure that they understand what the potential issues are and what the things they should be asking for, rather than just kind of dishing it all to the organisation.
Right, so in a way what you're suggesting is more like a kind of gold standard of privacy policy for a company.
Could be.
Okay.
Could be.
Yes, I mean, that's obviously an issue. And, my previous job was being Secretary of the Cabinet, and I know perfectly well that from that job that leak inquiries are usually fruitless. They very rarely, track down the actual leaker. But I think, maybe I'm a bit Pollyanna-ish about this, but I always think that it's better to start with the positive and to make sure that your staff have really good training and that, there's absolutely good security provisions in place. And, I think you have to remember that, yes, of course it's going to cost companies to try and fix this kind of thing. But if you don't do it, you might end up out of business because if it happens again and again and again through, some clear problem inside the organisation, then you may end up going out of business, or in the case of a government agency, having such reputational damage that life becomes pretty impossible. Oh, okay.
Isn't the having the breach disclosure notification be extremely refined? Isn't that going to be somewhat counterproductive? Because at least some of the reason for the breach disclosure is to force companies to think about security and to be more secure.
But I mean, there's a cost on you in terms of your time to be able to do that every single time. If we can provide some of that education across the board from if the consumer's coming to you with some of that information, then surely that's got to be a better situation for everybody.
Because they're worried because they keep getting these notices. And also, over-notification means people just
Explain this information to them, thank you, because it is such a persistent issue, but I don't see any reason why other developers and development shops couldn't be putting together this packet as well. That does put some of the responsibility back on the customer, that they will take the time to sit down and actually read it, which, as we all know from documentation, isn't entirely the case.
Was it me? So for those of you that don't know, I work for Consumer Affairs and I have no idea what a consumer information standard is. And I probably should, but it sounds like something that we would endorse, being that it has the word consumer in it. Aside from that, I don't know how helpful this is, but we did do a piece of work at Consumer Affairs working with the car parking industry just recently, and we came up with an industry code of conduct. And it's a voluntary document. No one is forced to sign up to it. But what it does is basically lists a number of expectations that the consumer has when they park in a private car park. And I wonder if something like that wouldn't be useful in this sort of situation as well. A code of conduct, I don't know where it would necessarily sit, but perhaps it would have a series of elements to it, international standards that it could relate to, so that consumers know when they are doing something like purchasing an off-the-shelf or a pre-designed website, that they know that certain criteria has been met in the design and construction of that site.
from a big company or even a small one has got up and said,
I mean, I think these things are useful. That you talk about being able to sit down with a client, as the lady did before, and say, have time to explain these things to them. But if you're not in the process of sitting down with anyone, if you're purchasing a $1.99 deal from a website that just says you will get cookie cutter template number 1 and that's that discussion can't go on. So I think some kind of guidance that can be provided to a consumer before they get into that process, no matter who they talk to, whether it's from a daily deal website or whether it's from a large agency, I think it's got to be a useful tool. So I don't know if that's a code of conduct. I really don't know what this thing's called. I just think there is a need for it. It's beginning to sound like maybe it could be a useful document. Yep.
So the document itself and the education, both to providers and customers, has got to be handled by some aegis at some point. Where would you see that coming from? Government, some sort of commission, or something like a consumer watchdog group, something like that?
I mean, I think it's probably not a government thing. I'm not sure that would be the right people to do it, but maybe a consumer group, maybe another NGO, or maybe a professional body. I mean, I don't know if there is, the Institute of Chartered Web Designers, if those things exist, but maybe that's the kind of organisation that would contribute to these kind of documents. But I think there's a good model to have both consumers and providers involved in that process, not just having some government or professional body saying this is what we want. I mean, that kind of goes back to those websites that say what you should expect from a web designer. It's just what you should expect from us. I think there needs to be a kind of a broad body that goes into this and says, we argue it out, we work out what's required, and we publish it as a group rather than just as one organisation saying this is what we think the gold standard is.
Just as a quick off topic, I like the idea you said chartered web designers there, because I'm not a web designer. I do quite a bit of web development work, but I suck at design. What can I say? I've got 2 artistic sisters, and I'm the family mathematician. But see, I really like the idea of actually having some form of charter for software developers, because I'm sick of seeing really kludgy code. So I'm just going to throw that out there just since you mentioned it. Yeah.
Yeah, I say web designers because I think that's kind of what people think of when they go to these kind of or these kind of smaller organisations, and that's some of the organisations that we've talked to. But that goes wider than that, I suppose. That's anyone who makes applications for the web.
Thank you. Just as a customer of having a website design hosted for teachers, actually, there is always one thing in inquiring which website company would be the most suitable for us. There is always a questionnaire, what do you want? Which is, the way to get to the customer. Yeah. I think that alongside, it would be very worthy maybe that there would be a questionnaire, what do you know? Alongside this, yes, a consumer straight away. Alongside this questionnaire, like what do you want, and then you go for the initial consultation, maybe for half an hour or something like this, having filled some of these questionnaires. If alongside, like, what do you know? Do you know anything privacy issue? Do you know and then there could be some things that, from a document, whatever it takes, that any of these companies could just draw in, and this is like standard information to get started. But this is where we hook that in that first conversation with the web company, no matter if it's a $99 or a $6,000 or whatever it is, there is this initial conversation, which is what do you know? And usually you don't know much what you want because you just have a vague idea. But it's from then on that the conversation is there. So maybe the opportunity to actually find out what the customer knows could happen there and then. I don't, maybe?
Yeah. I think one of the things I got from reading the Lance Wiggs blog was talking about that process, and lots of the larger design agencies that he spoke to make a point of talking to customers about this thing and going through the process, and that's part of their unique selling proposition. That's the thing that they do, and they do it well. And I think there's no doubt you would say that a quality agency will go through that, will raise those things, will explode the bombs before they go off in people's faces and make sure that there aren't hidden costs and all those other things that you can read about that make a good agency. My worry is that increasingly that New Zealand small businesses are not engaging with those organisations, and I get that from talking to some agencies that are frustrated by going through that entire process with someone, producing a quote at the end of it for 10 grand and then finding that the organisation says, well, thanks very much, but we found this thing. This guy knows to put together, you can put a WordPress thing on our server and he'll charge us $400. And I think increasingly that's going on, and increasingly businesses are missing out that first step and just going straight to the guy who, you know, we've got people at NetSafe who do it as a job at night, who make websites for people, and they'll whack up a WordPress template and say, there you go, and it's all done nice and cheaply. But yet, you know, we got a document a little while ago, 16 pages worth of how to harden a WordPress install. 16 pages of stuff, and when you read it, it's crazy stuff. If you know what you're doing, then fine. But if I'm a small business and someone said I can set up WordPress on this host that we used to use and everything will be fine, if you get one of those documents, you have no idea what you're doing. You've got no way to sort that. You've paid your $400 and the guy's out of the window. It disappeared from under you. And that's my concern, increasingly, that those kind of business transactions will go on less than the people who are prepared to engage in that whole process, pay the money and get a quality product at the end. Yeah.
Well, again, the new prevalence of the WordPress site. Oh, thank you. The prevalence of people wanting the WordPress site, the site they can update themselves, again, that puts a further communication burden on the developer because you've got to train them. And again, I'm providing an hour session and a training document, often via Skype, to people, and they've got the training reference as well, and a couple of URLs they can go to for further assistance. But 9 times out of 10, the tech support result is a call to me and an invoice bounced back to them.
Yeah, and again, that's when they know who you are and they've got a direct relationship with you and they've worked through that, then that's easy. But or easier, but again, there's a cost to you, and often you'll end up shouldering that cost, because despite the amount that you might say to them, this is what's included, here's the training, and that's the end of it, if it doesn't work, they're coming back to you, and you'll engage more time, more energy in getting it to work for them.
So I do have an investment in making it work in the first place.
Yeah. I'm not sure entirely that the kind of, you know, fill in your details here and I'll put a template on it and your website will be available right now. Those kind of organisations probably don't have the same requirement to invest that time. And I'm imagining that some consumers are not getting the same experience that you describe your consumers might. And that's who I think a lot of this protection is for.
Exactly, especially because we've all seen people whose web projects have been really seriously derailed by bad communication.
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk in some of the documents that you read about a good client versus a bad client, and also obviously a good provider versus a bad provider. Has anybody got any comments on what that is? It's seen as a very important, a good client, massively important, good provider, massively important. What's a good and a bad client?
It's just a common thing, but there's a little microblog called Clients from Hell, and it's just people just, it's like the daily WTF. People just post their horror stories to it, and it's absolutely risible. So I'm sure everybody here would get a chuckle out of it.
Thank you. Good client, bad client, an important thing. I mean, a lot of people talk about it as being a vital part of the equation, whether or not you get good clients or how to develop good clients. Is that an important thing?
Well, yet again, that's where communication with the client comes in, because I sit them down and let them know there's expectations on you. It's your responsibility to review promptly. It's your responsibility to have a clear picture of what your business is doing. I've actually fired clients who had an unclear idea of their branding or their customers, because that is completely out of my scope and leaves me open to all kinds of liability if their business goes under. And And I make it very clear, you know, this is what I expect you to provide for me, and this is our set of deadlines. I hate to use the analogy of training a slightly more intelligent than usual dog, but it is very apt. Another good thing about a good client is that they understand that time is money and they pay you in a timely fashion. And I'm sure a lot of us here who are doing development have had issues with that as well.
I'm just thinking vaguely that such a consumer guarantee would be just as much a protection to the web developers as it would be to the clients. And having been a party to a process of seeking a web developer recently, and realising that the web developers are completely disabled by an inexpertly communicated spec. And so the kind of thing that I'm thinking about is part of this process, a checklist. And so part of the checklist could be something around the static pages, something around the customer interaction, something around the kind of login, you know, the security. And I think something around, and the point was made about the difference between the architecture and the design, because often people go out looking for a design. And to me, that's a huge trap, because a lot of people in the web industry are very eager to talk about design, and they have to match what the client expects rather than talking about the absolute essentialness of the architecture.
Great. So what about then some ideas about good clients and what that process is? What about good providers from the other side? What is it that we think a consumer should be looking for in a provider organisation? What are the kind of key things that protect the consumer when they're picking, be it a large agency or be it a deal online?
A contract. I was quite shocked to pass on one of my major clients to a small web development house that could provide an e-commerce solution, and the web development house dissolved 3 months later for reasons that had nothing to do with the task at hand. But because my client had not asked for or received a contract from them, and he had not even had an email communication with them that could take the place of a contract or binding agreement, he actually wound up being out a good chunk of his deposit because they were unable to fulfill the commission.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a unique situation. We've spoken to lots of people who've been at the other end of that process without any kind of level of documentation. And some of that comes because it's someone you know that's just helping you out, but some of it comes because organisations just don't provide it.
Even if you are working out an agreement with somebody by email, include a sentence in your email saying, this is a formal agreement between us, please respond yes, and save that in your files. That can be all it takes to back both of you up legally.
Any other aspects of what makes a good provider that could provide sort of warning signs or warning signals for a consumer? Some of the things that consumers should think about when they're engaging an organisation?
I'm just thinking, given the nature of the service that they are providing, it must be very hard for the buyer to judge based on appearance. If they don't have references, they're looking at the appearance of a business, and given that they're going to be looking via the web at a web designer, how will they know without some external reference? I don't know the answer.
Yeah,
I mean it's an interesting challenge. In many other parts of our industry, the web or the appearance of the business is a good sign about the scale, the maturity and the robustness of that business. In this case, not so much.
There's a reason Selfridges has got big pillars and Baroque sculptures over the doors. You know, I think you're exactly right, and you can't tell, I suppose, from just that, from just taking a look at the website, and maybe even not from reading client testimonials, because you can, you know, let's face it. Yeah, you can pretend that they are, or you can just take the sentence out that makes you sound great. And I think that's part of what hopefully this kind of standard could do, to say that, you know, you go beyond looking for testimonials, but there are these things that you need to ask. Are they prepared to provide quote? What's the documentations like? I mean, I'm picking these things out of the air, but will they provide contact details for these testimonials? Can you talk directly to the customers? I mean, I don't know what they are, but I think if you can provide some of these things, and as a checklist, maybe a consumer standard is too grandiose a title. Maybe this is just, you know, provide a checklist, client checklist. But even that, backed by something, backed centrally, not just written by an agency, but written by a group that's prepared to contribute their best thinking. Maybe that's all we need, to be able to say these are the 5 things you ask them to work out what sort of company that they are.
I was just going to add to both those points. I think, you know, you're sort of saying the good and the bad. I have been a client before, and to be quite honest, from the client perspective, I don't care. Just make it work. You know, so I'm looking for an e-commerce site that includes a shopping cart with a backup content management system. That's a shed load of IT to wrap my head around as a small business owner. I don't care. I just want it to work. I don't care what happens with the data, how it's stored, what sort of encryption standard it has. So I think whatever this thing could look like, I think it would be really useful in terms of just knowing that as the consumer, that there's this whole level of checks that have been met, so that from my point of view, I know I can just stick this thing online. Not only does it work, but it's also keeping data safe.
Again, the challenge is the customer's ability to verify what's being said by their provider, and maybe that's answered by the contract. So if you've got a contract that clearly states the site is going to be developed in accordance with OWASP as an external reference, and compliant to PCI as another external reference, and that's in the requirements and the contract that's in place. If it doesn't meet those requirements, then there's some sort of recourse. But the fact that it's in the agreement puts a bit more pressure, puts a bit more onus on the supplier of that site to get it right. I think there are some external references, you know, the standards. It's just educating the buyer to reference them, I think, is needed.
So, again, I hadn't thought about it before, but I'm now thinking about the, you know, like certified master builder concept. And, you know, building's a very technical industry, but you often engage a builder, or people will engage builders based on an industry certification. The fact that there's a stamp or the Heart Foundation tick. I talked about this with Jared the other day. Maybe is that enough? Is that the kind of level that consumers are looking for? That they don't need to be able to, that the provider says we follow certain standards, and that gives us the tick. The thing about tick is it needs to have an organisation behind it that says we've got the rights to give that tick. And I don't know who that would be within the web community in New Zealand. I think it should be local if we were going to do it, and I think it should be an organisation that's trusted, but I'm not sure who that would necessarily be.
So I don't think there really is a completely relevant professional body like that. I mean, one thing just in terms of the certification idea, I can't quite remember the exact wording, but it's something like the IT certified professionals, I think is the phrase. So that's more on the IT side of it. I don't know if they cover the web development rather than, say, the web design components, but they potentially could be approached on that side of things. I guess just going back a couple of points earlier, I think, you know, I guess a website buyer's guide type sort of thing is kind of an approach. It sounds like we're sort of banding around. I think that could be really, really valuable. I think having, I mean, if you look at, like, say, buying a car, you know, so if you buy a car from of trade me or something, there's guides around there, what sorts of things can you check relatively easily as a consumer, and there are third parties who can do things like, do a mechanical inspection like AA. Now, it's harder to necessarily, if you're commissioning a site, then you're probably having to select the partner before it's actually built, so you can't necessarily do the pre-inspection as you would with a vehicle. But I think there are elements of those other models that can be adapted. I think having a buyer's guide that just sort of explains some of the process and some of the terms, having a set of questions that you ask of the suppliers, and that you get commitment from them that they'll achieve this is one thing. How you go about the recourse if they don't meet that, that's another question, but I guess at least if you're asking them up front, that helps. And I mean, I guess just coming back to an earlier question, which was, what makes a good supplier? I mean, it's funny. I mean, for instance, for us, we will give people, phone numbers and contact details of our other customers. And most of the time, those people never get contacted. So it's funny that you might actually go about doing those things, and then they're not really utilised anyway. So, but I think those types of things you should be ringing up other suppliers. And I think the other side of it too, which is kind of coming back to Lance Wiggs' point, is a good supplier is one that has done work in a related geography or the scale of the site. So you don't get a 99 website builder to commission a $20,000 one or a $200,000 one. Even if they have the skills, organisationally they're not going to be suited to actually deliver that in a feasible manner. So all of that type of thinking, I think, can go in there. I seem to remember a guide. At one point I was looking at building a house, and so there was a guide from some entity, and I forget who it might have been. It might have been...
Is it brands?
It might have been brands, or I'm just trying to think of the certification, like master builders. It was one of those types of entities, but they definitely had a nice glossy 20-page document that I found as a newbie to the whole idea of building a house or commissioning someone to build a house. It just took through the whole process in quite a structured manner, and it may have had, like a little piece of paper at the back of it that you could pull out and a list of 20 questions and that type of thing. So I think if you looked up that resource, perhaps I can see if I can dig it up again as a PDF or something. That could be, one early win.
Cool.
From a certification point of view, it's sort of difficult to trust them because they go out of date so quickly. And I think there would need to be some sort of auditing that the website you're buying is actually using the sort of certified ideas or technology, or because the new shiny thing comes along, the developers all jump onto that, and often the security properties are just not there. And I don't know, should there be a recommendation that your $99 website gets pen tested? Maybe if it's static, perhaps not, but your $5,000 e-commerce site probably should be, and that might be another $5,000.
It's not something you do on a $99 website.
And sorry, I was just going to add another point that there's also an international element to this that would need to be considered. That you can buy a lot of off-the-shelf products now online from international providers, and a number of people selling websites in New Zealand now are actually just outsourcing the work to developers in India and China. And that $5,000 website, they're actually paying $500 for it. So the consumer information standard, for instance, on your car window, works very well because I can't buy a car from China, even though certain people from China would try and suggest that I could sell them my car or buy a car from them. But I think if the standard is New Zealand based and I'm purchasing a website from overseas, there needs to be some way of being able to police that standard.
Hi, I'm just doing in my mind a bit of an inventory of the kinds of standards around IT and websites that already exist, and so and which could be used as the starting point for the development of a New Zealand standard. So I'm thinking of the W3C, the New Zealand Web Standards for Government Departments, which, as somebody pointed out, the standards change and they are regularly updated. I believe that there are some New Zealand standards around information systems, so they're behind, obviously, the standards paywall. I'm certain, I mean, are we looking overseas for examples of other web organisations that have already done something like this? And finally, I guess the New Zealand Computer Society has some professional and ethical standards which could be used as a starting point for developing the proposed initiative.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, I think that the thing about those documents, you're right, there are probably parts of those that are applicable across here, but that the consumers won't necessarily go to and pluck them out. I think even just the process of bringing together some of the relevant parts that already exist is probably a step forward. I think that you know, any step we make is probably a step forward from the position that we're currently in.
I just mentioned there is another party we haven't mentioned yet who could benefit from standards or code of conduct or something, and that's the website user. You go onto a website, you have an expectation if you provide your credit card details it'll be safe, and that the website isn't open to sending out viruses and spam and God knows what else. I'm not saying, I don't know if you can regulate, I mean anyone can put a website up, I don't know how you regulate it, but there's an industry standard for the developers that could cover that, and there needs to be some thought about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing sometimes that the pressure doesn't come from that direction, that it doesn't necessarily come from the consumers, because you'd think that before there are enough horror stories, I guess, out there that you'd think maybe before you put in your personal details, your credit card details, you might want some kind of assurance of where it's going. But I think often people don't. They just plough through because the desire to get what they want is stronger than the desire to get there. Hey, we'll come close to the end. If anybody has any kind of last comments, or if not, we'll probably wrap it up quite soon. Look, thanks very much for contributing. Look, I know I said at the start I wasn't entirely sure whether or not this was the right thing to do, but I'm beginning to get the feeling that in some form it is. I don't know whether the title that we use, a consumer standard, is necessarily exactly what will come in it. Consumer standard sounds kind of large and almost law-like, but I think there's certainly room for the industry and consumers to get together in some way and try and develop some guidelines, some ground rules about what it is you should expect when you first engage that, without too much jargonese and without too much extra stuff and kind of marketing information getting in the way. So I'm happy to continue with this work, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone. We'll try and engage some of those bodies and some of those groups that already have those standards. But if you do want to help contribute to that process, keep an eye on the NetSafe website. We'll keep talking about this process from there. Sorry.
I've just found that master builder PDF and I've just tweeted it on hashtag NetHui right now.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.